Alright, so you'd think that this question had been answered enough. What kind of oil? What type? Synthetic? Non-synthetic? Well, let's get into it, let's talk about it, and see if we can make some sense out of it. Alright, so as you know, if you've been around my channel for any length of time, you know that I work on the old stuff, and I work all the way to anything in between to the new stuff. This is an engine that I'm standing beside. It's out of a 1964 Mercury Comet. It is a 260 small block Ford engine. This engine was designed and built back in a time when oil was not what it is today. The requirements for this engine and the oil that it takes is not the requirements of what our engines take today. Come on over, Mr. Cameraman. I'd like to do a little show and tell. Get in here, and as you can see, there is sludge buildup. And what we call this in the automotive industry, if you've been around it as long as I have, we called this Quaker cake, because of the kind of oil that was used back in the day. Was a lot of Quaker State was used, and this oil was a paraffin-based oil, and it had a tendency to cake and coke up your engine, particularly if it wasn't changed often enough. Alright, so one of the things, I don't know if I said this or not, but this is as it was built in 1964. This engine, to my knowledge, has not been taken apart. So all of the accumulation is as it was, has built up since 1964. Over on the engine stand, I have another 1964 engine, but it's a Chevrolet 327. It has been rebuilt. Not exactly sure how many miles are on it, but we do know that it has been used some. But let's walk over here and we'll take a look and see what it looks like. Alright, you can look down inside the valley and you can see that there is no coking, there's no caking of the oil, there's no carbon buildup, no debris. You can look here in the tops of the head, and this is a direct result of changing the motor oil when it's supposed to be changed and using a high quality engine oil. Alright, so this begs the question that I often get asked. Can I run synthetic engine oil in my old engine? Yes and no. Yes, you can. No, I don't recommend it. And this is why. Unless you know your engine looks like that one over on the other engine stand that's perfectly cleaned and freshly rebuilt, the problem you have with fresh, new synthetic oils is the detergents that are in them will begin to clean all of this stuff up that's in this engine. All of this caking and coking. It is has very high detergents. It is very good at what it does. It will begin to start breaking this stuff loose, and it will begin to get into your engine and get circulated through your engine. Could potentially stop up an oil filter, and some of the other things that it can do is, like I said, it starts disturbing this stuff, and some of this stuff can get sucked into the oil pump, shorten the life, or even kill the oil pump. I've seen it to the point to where the screen on the bottom of the oil pump pickup begins to plug up and starve the engine for oil. This is why I tell people, do not run synthetic engine oil in an older engine. So the last point on running synthetic oil in an older engine like this right here, while I don't think the synthetic oil causes oil leaks, what I believe it does is, you can see we talked about the caking and the coking of this oil. That is all over every component in this oil. It is around all the seals, it is around all the crankshafts, and it is around everything. So when you begin to run, as I said, the synthetic, and it has the detergents in it, and it begins to clean that stuff up, it washes that stuff away from around the seals. And at that point, the synthetic oil does such a good job at cleaning, the oil will begin to leak out of a seal that ordinarily might have had a drip or two goes from a drip or two with conventional oil to you're now replacing seals in your old engine. Alright, so let's talk a little bit more about the modern stuff. Let's talk about why the full synthetic in the modern stuff and why they've done away, or not necessarily done away, but have moved further away from and used less zinc in the modern fully synthetic engine oils. Back in 1994 is when they started first making these moves to get away from the zinc, the ZDDP. ZDDP. Say that 3 times real fast. Anyway, the main reason that they started getting away from it was that they were finding that since they had moved to the catalyst emissions, that it was poisoning the catalytic converters on the automobile and shortening their life. So, in an ever-increasing EPA-driven world, what they needed to try to do is to extend the life of the catalytic converter, which would reduce the emissions coming out of the tailpipe for longer. As time has gone on, they have developed better and better synthetic oils. They have made them thinner, and one of the main reasons that they've done that is to increase fuel economy. Thinner oil, components that are moving inside the engine move through the oil easier. One of the other things that they have done in an effort to offset having less ZDDP in the oil is they've redesigned the components inside the engine to not need as much ZDDP, zinc. Alright, so let's go over and talk about oil drain intervals. With the more modern, fully synthetic engine oils, you can run longer than you could back in the day with these old cars. Back in the day, when these cars were first designed, some of these vehicles didn't even come with an oil filter on them. Some of the drain intervals on cars like back in the day, in the 54, 1,000 miles, 1,500 miles, 2,000 miles was the longest you would want to go before changing your engine oil. Another thing to keep in mind is back in the 50s, the average American was only driving their vehicle between 8,000 to 9,000 miles a year. Now let's talk about the modern cars, like this 21 Toyota Highlander, who the manufacturer says to change the oil every 10,000 miles. That is a 5-time increase over what we used to do in many cases. Can you safely go 10,000 miles between changing your oil and filter? In some cases, I say yes. But there's some very specific things that go along with the oil changes at 10,000 miles. And that would be that if you were using your vehicle enough and driving it in a manner which would meet the 10,000 mile criteria. If you're driving your vehicle at least 55 to 60 miles a day, and most of that driving time is on the interstate, yes, you can go every 6 months or every 10,000 miles. The average American driver only drives their vehicle about 15,000 miles a year, so this is not going to apply to the vast majority of automobiles on the road. My recommendation, which would be the next step down, which would be 5,000 to 7,500 miles, somewhere in that range, is probably where most Americans are going to fall into the oil change interval and category. And on the low end of the spectrum is somebody who only drives 3,000 to 5,000 miles a year, like my dad, in which case you probably could get away with a yearly oil change in that scenario. Alright, so I hope that has answered some of your questions and given you a mechanic's perspective on the synthetic versus non-synthetic versus when you should change your oil. I hope that's been beneficial to you. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link down in the description, and you may find it interesting. I did, and it was a video about engineering explained. If you've never seen that video, I encourage you to go watch it. It gives a really in-depth look at conventional oils and how synthetic oil is derived and made and why it's so much better. So until I can get out a new video, why don't you go out and watch one coming on the screen right now.